Our story begins in a beautiful modern flower store, in which pots of flowers were hanging directly from the ceiling. There was also a bicycle parked near it, with baskets of flowers on the trunk. In the middle of all this beauty, a guy with blue hair was sitting at a desk with his nose in a textbook. Around him were two large stacks of books that looked like a challenge. Being in such a desperate position, he muttered in a tired voice that he couldn't take it anymore. Then raising his head, with his pen in his mouth, he added in an exhausted voice that all this was making his head hurt, and that he might soon explode. Hearing her son's complaints, his mother, who came to pick up the empty bowl, asked in a reproachful voice if he had started to relax just 5 minutes after picking up the book. After taking the empty bowl, she asked in an irritated voice when he would stop bothering her, then citing the example of his aunt's son, who, according to her, was better than him in everything and went to extra classes every day for 2 hours, which was much harder than skipping classes like him. Finishing the reprimand and heading for the exit, his mother told the boy, who continued to sit bored, to help her hang the hanging baskets on the shelves, reminding him to remember to tie the rope well, as otherwise it might fall down in a strong wind. Climbing up the stepladder, our protagonist, holding a pot of plants that he intended to hang, he turned to his mother, saying that they should have connected an automatic watering system a long time ago. This would free up a lot of time and energy, as hanging and taking down the pots each time was a hassle. Afterwards, he continued to hang the pot and said in a dreamy voice that in his next life he would like to be a plant, because all they had to do to grow up was to bask in the sun and drink water. What a wonderful and carefree life they had. His mother saw that he was standing on a stepladder on one leg, distracted by her thoughts and forgetting about safety, in a panic waved her hands and told him to come down quickly, adding that she would finish everything herself. But as soon as our protagonist came down, he received a not-so-pleasant reprimand. Covering his ears with his hands, he tried to muffle the furious shouts of his mother, who called him lazy and said that he should study while he was young, because when he grows up, everything will not be so easy and he will realize what a carefree time he had during his studies. Having had the opportunity to escape from home, our protagonist, walking down the street with a book in his hands, yawning, thought about the fact that because of his mother's reprimand he had a headache again. In addition, he could not understand why his mother was so worried about his education, which, in his opinion, was too troublesome, heavy, boring and useless. Plus she talked very much and fast, just like the pea shooter from the game he was playing. At the same time, a pot with a plant known as a flytrap flew off the windowsill of one of the houses under which our protagonist was passing, driven by an unknown force. After which it began to fall at high speed directly on our protagonist, who, unsuspecting, yawned and went about his business. The next moment there was the sound of a blow and the smashing of a pot, from which the remains of it and the dirt mixed with blood were sprinkled on the ground. Our protagonist found himself lying on the ground in a pool of blood, with the remains of what had once been a pot of flowers on his head. Passing at this time on the street, people who happened to see what happened, in a panic began to shout that a pot fell on some guy, and that it was necessary to call an ambulance. As it turned out later, the trucksan had the week off that week, so his job had to be done by the potty, who ended up doing a pretty good job. At the same time, memories of the past flashed through the guy's mind. In front of his eyes on the table was a fancy dinner. Suddenly, he heard the gentle voice of his mother, who called him to the table. As he sat down at the table with his family and took a bowl of rice, he was delighted to eat the delicious food his mom had prepared. There was a warm family atmosphere at the table and surprisingly no one reprimanded him for his studies. However, as soon as he ate some rice from the bowl, he realized that something was wrong, namely the taste of the rice was somehow strange. The very next moment he looked at the bowl of rice again, the protagonist found that instead of rice, there was dirt. Puzzled, he began to spit the dirt out of his mouth, wondering why he was eating dirt. However, the very next moment he found himself in a space he did not understand, where it was very dark and smelled very unpleasant. In addition, he felt that his arms and legs were restrained, which created a rather unusual sensation. Looking up, he found that there was a light upstairs. Deciding to check what the light was, he tried to rise up and reached for it. The next moment, a golden glow erupted from the ground, causing pieces of earth to scatter in all directions. As it turned out, a new plant was born, which had a beautiful pink bud at its end, which was illuminated by the bright and warm sunlight. It was none other than our protagonist, who while enjoying the pleasant sunlight glowing with happiness, joyfully said to himself that he was finally able to get out. However, the next moment his joy was abruptly replaced by bewilderment, as his body felt somehow strange. In addition, looking at the place where his hand should have been, he found a green leaf. The subsequent examination of his new body, which as it turned out consisted only of a stem, a bud, and 2 leaves, brought our protagonist into a state of shock, as he could not understand why he became like this, and in general, what happened to him. Standing in a motionless posture and trying to understand what was happening, he slowly began to realize that he was in a field, which was brightly lit by the sun, and on which there were many flowers like him. After recovering from the shock and coming to his senses a bit, he shouted furiously, saying that why out of all the options of what he could be reborn as, he had been chosen to become a flower. "What the hell is going on here?" screamed our protagonist to himself, as that was the only question he had right now. However, the next moment, memories of his death, which was caused by a pot hitting him on the head, popped into his head. Relating this to who he was now, he came to the conclusion that he had reincarnated into an ordinary plant. Realizing this caused the protagonist to become depressed, as the prospect of being a flower didn't seem very rosy to him. But the worst part was that it was probably because of his thoughts about how easy it was for plants to live, in which he told himself that he wouldn't mind becoming one of them. He was reborn into a normal plant after his death. The mere thought of this horrified the protagonist. The next second rivers of tears came from his eyes, while he himself began to lament the fate that had taken his words, which he said without giving them meaning and without thinking that they could come true, so seriously. Then he began to cry even harder, begging the one who had done this to him to bring him back as soon as possible. The next moment, however, he had an epiphany. In all the web novels he had read, the protagonist who went to the other world always had his own system, thanks to which he became a god in a matter of seconds. But even though his rebirth story was very similar to all those stories in the novels, there was never a voice from the sky to guide him, or a system window where he could raise his level. Deciding that the system hadn't noticed him and was just sound asleep, our protagonist started screaming with all his might, calling out to the system and telling it to wake up. His scream was so loud that it frightened all the plants near him, which immediately began to look at him with apprehension. But even after some time, during which many unpleasant words were said to the system, still nothing happened. A week after entering the new world and reincarnating into a plant, our protagonist, being in a very depressed state, summarized the past week. The bad news was that despite the fact that he had been trying to summon the system all week, it hadn't shown up. The good news, however, was that he now knew that he wasn't just an ordinary piece of grass. However, the fact that he wasn't just an ordinary plant was the last bit of good news, as he was still just an ordinary flower that just had a mind, which was nothing compared to the 7-foot body he had before. Luckily his sadness was somewhat dispelled by the fact that the soil he was growing on was very good, as it was rich in nutrients, as well as being fragrant and tasty, and he could feel himself slowly starting to grow even faster than the other plants around him. But as he grew, he began to feel that he was getting more and more cramped among all these plants. In the next moment he felt very much what competition was like. The sun that was supposed to be shining on him simply disappeared, leaving the protagonist bewildered. As soon as he looked up, however, he realized everything. Right above him were many other flowers that had grown taller than him and were reaching for the sun, obscuring it with their buds. This drove the protagonist to despair. He began to appeal to their conscience, saying that they should not be so greedy. From this scene, he immediately had a flashback of his past life in his mind, where he was in a very similar situation at school. While the other kids raised their hands wanting to answer, he huddled against his desk hoping he wouldn't be asked. These memories were not very pleasant or desirable for the protagonist. But it was an additional motivation, as he now didn't want to repeat the mistakes of the past. Squeezing between his competitors, who looked at him with surprised as well as disgruntled looks, he finally managed to squeeze his way to the top. This small victory was like a breath of fresh air for the protagonist. Feeling the warm rays of the sun, he happily told himself that he could finally relax and sunbathe. However, His relaxing time was short-lived, as a silhouette appeared on the horizon, which immediately caught the protagonist's attention, making him wonder what it was. As the silhouette got closer, the protagonist recognized the strange creature as either a llama or an alpaca. Even though his parents were very busy and never took him to the zoo, he was still able to recognize it. This event was quite exciting for the protagonist, as it was the first time he saw this mythical beast, and to his surprise it turned out to be quite cute. But the next moment he changed his mind, as he suddenly realized that this seemingly harmless herbivorous beast was a great danger to him. After all, right now he was nothing more than ordinary grass to him. Unfortunately, in the next moment his not the most positive assumptions came true, and this mythical creature, resembling an alpaca, opened its mouth with saliva dripping and white teeth, which seemed to want to eat you, began to approach the protagonist. That same realized what situation to be in a panic began to shout that the creature did not approach. But his screams were of no use at all. Realizing that there was no other way out, the protagonist in a panic leaned as close to the ground as possible, covering his head with leaves. Gritting his teeth, he desperately muttered that he didn't want to die like this. Just when he thought he was going to die, he realized he was still alive when he felt a slight breeze and the sound of stalks snapping off. As it turned out, the alpaca's tongue had not reached him, thanks to his low stature and the fact that he had ducked down. At the same time, the alpaca-like creature, unaware that it was about to interrupt the plot of a cool manhwa, was nonchalantly continuing to chew on the protagonist's kin, who was still trying to come to his senses and believe he was still alive. The alpaca suddenly turned around and started walking away, heading away from where it came from. Seeing this, our protagonist, who had a little time to come to his senses, concluded that most likely the flowers and plants that grew in this area were not suitable for the mythical animal, since it left immediately after one bite. But the llama didn't leave just like that, it left a small gift. At the sight of which the protagonist had a lot of questions, for example, why the land on which he grew up was so much like the dung pile that the mythical llama left behind. After connecting all the dots and realizing that he was born from a pile of dung, our protagonist began to slowly turn into a stone statue of Moai. Upon coming to his senses, he felt so sick from realizing what he had been eating all this time, he even threw up. Looking at the pink flowers, which were basking in the sun, swayed happily in the breeze. Our protagonist smiled a fanged smile, thinking about how good it must be for them to live such a carefree life without worrying about anything, while he even when he became a plant continued to worry about his life. Catching the gaze of the protagonist, who was looking at them and smiling his toothy smile, the flowers stared at him warily, not knowing what to expect from him. In front of the protagonist at that moment appeared a rather large mirror, in which he was surprised to see his reflection. Even though he couldn't see himself before, he could still see that he had changed a lot. At the base of his bud, he had leaves that looked like a hat, a small spiral antenna on top, and he had fangs as well as thorns all over his stem. Seeing himself from the outside, the protagonist fell into a stupor, unable to say anything. In his mind, memories of his past life immediately came to mind, in which, as a child, he had played a computer game with his friend, in which every time he played as a plant with a big mouth, he had failed miserably. And that's exactly what he was now, a plant with a big mouth. Looking around, he immediately noticed the change in his surroundings that was caused by his new appearance. Namely that all the plants around him were looking at him strangely, making him feel out of place. However, he suddenly remembered something he hadn't noticed at first. He immediately turned back to the mirror, which seemed out of the ordinary, and considering that it had appeared out of nowhere, it could be considered an unusual object. Not understanding how it could be interacted with, the protagonist decided to simply touch it to begin with. As soon as his leaf touched the mirror, it immediately began to disappear, but in the next second he saw not a mirror, but a full-fledged system notification, which he had previously read about in web novels, informing him that the system had detected that the host had bloomed and penetrated the plant body. As a result of which the flower system was automatically activated. When he read his master's message, the hero was indescribably delighted and excited, making his already pink bud even redder. His dream had finally come true, and now he was no longer just an ordinary flower, but now he could develop and grow stronger. While he was rejoicing over the system, a very strange creature appeared in front of him as if out of nowhere, with a body like a baby, a head like a girl's, but a face with the stubble of a grown man. I won't describe it anymore. I don't even know what the guy who drew this manhwa was smoking, but let's get back to our story. The strange creature greeted the protagonist and called him a small master and introduced himself as the system spirit Ruhwa. After that, a system window immediately appeared in front of the protagonist, displaying his status and characteristics. His name was Wu Sun, while he belonged to the flower race with a big mouth. His height was 0.3 meters, his level was 0, the number of genes available was 0, there was one attack skill called Swallowing Living. However, other than that, there were no normal or special skills anymore. The description, however, said that he was a flower with a large mouth that was planted in the dung of an alpaca. After reviewing his status, the protagonist came to resentment as he had almost no skills. There was one attacker, however, he still didn't know how to use it yet. However, the next moment, another system window opened in front of him with information on how he could earn evolution points. There were a total of 3 ways he could earn evolution points. The first was to bask in the sun for a minute to earn 1 evolution point, the second was to absorb moisture from the soil, and the third was to absorb minerals. Wu Sun froze for a second as he didn't immediately realize what he had read. But after a moment, his eyes lit up with joy, as evolution and the evolution points he needed for it was something he had dreamed of since his first moment after being reborn. Plus it meant that he could finally get a move on and start evolving. Plus, he noted that even while he was rejoicing, the evolution points didn't stop gaining. The next moment he was laughing out loud, boasting that he had already accumulated 100 evolution points in such a short time thanks to his cheat system. The flowers growing around him stared at the protagonist in amazement, not understanding what was happening to him. However, the protagonist's laughter didn't last long, as he was interrupted by Ruhwa the next moment. Flying over to Wu Sun, the strange creature said that since he had gained 100 evolution points, he had the ability to strengthen the 6 main parts of his body, namely the stem, leaf, root, fruit, and seed. Upon hearing Ruhwa's words, the protagonist immediately happily agreed, saying that he had long wanted to strengthen his stem so that he could grow even bigger and stronger, allowing him to receive even more sunlight. The next moment, a new system window appeared, informing that 100 evolution points had been spent to strengthen the stem, followed by the fact that the main character's stem had indeed changed. Although they were very minor, because the next notification window said that the length of the stem was increased only by 0.003 meters. This didn't stop the protagonist from rejoicing. Smiling with the smile of a villain who intended to take over the world, Wu Sun proudly raised his petal upwards. The flowers that grew around him were still unable to comprehend our genius as before. However, after a moment, he realized that the height he had grown to was indeed very small and insignificant, something he had not immediately noticed in a rush of emotion. Seeing that the protagonist had become despondent, Ruhwa decided to support him and said that this was only the beginning of the journey, and his current rate of development would increase over time. Hearing the system spirit's words, the protagonist looked up to the sky, dreamily contemplating when he could become very strong and majestic. And when he would no longer have any enemies to hinder him, he would be able to rest in peace, basking in the warm rays of the sun. However, for such a life, now one had to be patient and continue to grow. Suddenly, a buzzing sound was heard nearby, followed by the appearance of a wasp. As if there was nowhere else to fly, it headed towards the protagonist. When he saw the wasp, he became wary, looking at it with a contemptuous look, then added that it would not even think of stinging him. However, the wasp simply began to circle around the protagonist. This behavior from the wasp began to annoy Wu Sun. As a result, his patience broke down, and he began waving his leaves with fierce cries that he was not in the mood. Also shouting that he didn't belong here where she couldn't gather nectar, and also adding to tell her to get lost sooner rather than later. However, his shouting and waving his leaves not only didn't help, but only made it worse. Because suddenly, the wasp flew sharply into the open mouth of the protagonist. This unexpected turn of events left him confused while the wasp was still buzzing in his mouth. In the next moment, he realized what he had just done, causing him to immediately break out in sweat. In his 18 years in his previous life, he had never eaten anything raw, much less a wasp. Opening his mouth, he immediately tried to spit out the insect, he even put a leaf in his mouth, hoping to get it out. However, it was already too late. But to his surprise he found that the taste of the wasp was not so bad. This news was not the most pleasant for him, but now he had to accept it. Suddenly, the system's spirit Ruhwa suddenly appeared out of nowhere and joyfully turned to his master and announced that he had been rewarded for his first achievement, namely the first time he had consumed a living creature. The reward was a golden treasure chest, which could be opened for 10,000 evolution points. At the same moment, a system window appeared in front of the protagonist, informing him that the chest was called the treasure chest. It was further reported that when the system master swallowed a living creature, he could get just such a chest. They could be opened for a certain amount of money, and the reward could be transformation points, plant genes, and other rewards that could help him become stronger. This information was like a light at the end of the tunnel for Wu Sun, as it could be a great opportunity to speed up his development. In addition, eating living creatures in exchange for the chest seemed very profitable to the protagonist. However, the number of evolution points required to open one chest brought him down to earth. In addition, he realized that he would have to work very hard in the near future if he wanted to open this chest. 5 long days later. Barely hanging on to his stalk, Wu Sun looked very exhausted and depleted. As it turned out, basking in the sun, absorbing moisture and beneficial minerals was much harder than he thought. Throughout the 5 days, he continuously tried to get as many evolution points as possible. And as a result, he was able to do just that. After realizing that he had finally gained enough points, the protagonist's fatigue was lifted. His eyes lit up, and he joyfully shouted to the system spirit that he wanted to open the chest. Ruhwa heard the desire of the protagonist immediately appeared with the chest, which opened with a bright golden glow. The next moment, a system window appeared in front of the protagonist, showing a vine or whip of some kind of plant. In the description, the system congratulated the host for receiving a level B implant, the vine genome, which was to modify and fuse with the main character's stem. After reading the description, Wu Sun had many questions, such as whether these vines were a replacement for his hands, or if they were separately attached to the stem, or if they were even legendary tentacles that he could freely control. In addition, he noticed that his new genin was level B, which couldn't help but make him happy. After that, the system window displayed all the parts that made up his current body, and with which he could fuse his new vine implant. Without hesitating, he immediately and decisively shouted to the system to start the fusion. In the next second, the place where the fusion took place, namely the stem, lit up with a bright green light. After that, he received a congratulatory message from the system, congratulating him on his successful fusion with the vine gene. The next moment, the protagonist's eyes lit up with green light, giving him an intimidating appearance, and instead of leaves, he had a big whip. The system also reported that by fusing with the vine gene, Wu Sun could now turn the stems or leaves into thick vine that he could whip or bind the enemy with. Having gained a new power he had never dreamed of, our protagonist was on the path of no return, telling himself that he would henceforth call himself the tentacle monster. However, the reality was different. In reality, once Wu Sun accessed the vines, he couldn't get enough of them. He felt that they were very soft and flexible, as if he was manipulating his fingers in a human body. As a result, he found no better use for them than to bend them into figures in the air. However, that wasn't the most useful thing he could do with them. After reading the descriptions, he realized that in the future he would also be able to unexpectedly attack the enemy from underground. The very next moment, he was already fantasizing about how he was massacring the wasps that might come next. And how he would capture their queen. But then his musings were interrupted by a buzzing sound from a wasp flying nearby. As if teasing, it flew in circles again, annoying the protagonist with its buzzing. Another appearance of a wasp made Wu Sun wonder if there was a wasp nest nearby. Deciding that this was the perfect opportunity for him to practice controlling his new vine, the protagonist launched it towards the wasp at breakneck speed. The vine was surrounded by green lightning bolts, causing Wu Sun to come up with the name Lightning Whip for this technique. Feeling danger approaching, the wasp turned around and saw the vine in front of him covered in a green glow, reaching out to grab it. And in the moment it seemed like it was all over for the wasp. The distance that Wu Sun could extend his whips had reached its maximum, and as a result, no matter how hard he tried, he was unable to reach it. As he frustratedly lowered his whip, the protagonist tried to console himself and said to himself that he couldn't catch the big hornet so easily anyway, adding that the best solution would be to wait for it to come closer. Then he wondered if he could apply the enhancement he had seen before to the vines, perhaps making them thicker and longer. The wasp, meanwhile, hovered in the air and looked at Wu Sun with a haughty smile. As if trying to say that he was a loser who was not capable of anything. This arrogant behavior hurt the protagonist, but he continued to endure and did not show any signs, because he knew that if he could endure it now, the wasp would definitely relax and come closer. And even then, he would be able to take full revenge for his humiliation. When the moment seemed to have arrived, and the wasp was close enough to be reached, Wu Sun shouted loudly that this time he wouldn't let it go. He released his vines at a great speed towards it. But to Wu Sun's surprise, his tentacle was not able to reach its target as it was intercepted by someone else a second before. This unexpected turn of events shocked not only the protagonist, but also the wasp itself, which did not understand what was happening. The culprit was the yellow gecko, who was holding the wasp in his mouth and looking at the protagonist with a smile. Such insolence made Wu Sun furious, as he had no intention of sharing his food with anyone else at all. In the next moment, fire flared in his eyes, and he let out a fierce shout as he released his whips covered in green lightning bolts towards him, shouting that since he was taking away his food, he should be held responsible for it. Turning around, the gecko was confused to find that his tail was wrapped around some strange vine that held it tightly. Not wanting to be tied up, the gecko made an attempt to resist and try to escape, but unfortunately the vines held him very tightly, preventing him from doing so. Seeing that the lizard was resisting in a panic and trying to escape, Wu Sun gripped its tail even tighter, and said in an irritated voice that its attempts were futile as he had no intention of letting it go so easily. However, in the next moment, something happened that the protagonist did not expect in any way. Part of the gecko's tail, which he was holding with his tentacles, suddenly separated from his body. And since the tension was quite strong, the whips, which flew backwards by inertia, hit him in the face with force. While the protagonist was recovering from the slap he had inflicted on himself, the gecko, not wanting to miss this chance, began to quickly get away from the dangerous plant, which was our protagonist. Wu Sun was both furious and confused as he realized that it was his fault for forgetting that lizards could throw back their tails. But he did manage to get something, and that was the tail, which remained in his tentacles. He decided it would be unwise to be upset about it, so he stuffed the rest of the tail into his mouth, adding that it was still better than nothing. After standing there gloomily for a while, waiting for the system's messages and hoping that he would get the treasure chest again, he had not received a single message in the meantime. However, Wu Sun realized that the only way to get the treasure chest reward was to eat an entire living creature. Scratching the back of his head, he complained in a somewhat dull voice that there were very few insects in the area. Even flies and ants, which are always plentiful everywhere, were nowhere to be found. A week later, an innocent beetle running by was grabbed by a green tentacle that suddenly appeared out of nowhere. And the next moment it went straight into the mouth of the protagonist, who opened it wide and ruthlessly ate the beetle. While the emotions of the flowers in the background changed from bewilderment to admiration. The next moment, a golden chest appeared in front of Wu Sun, accompanied by the voice of the system, which congratulated the protagonist for eating the dung beetle and obtaining the chest as a result, and informed him that 10,000 evolution points were required to open it. A note on the notification window that popped up also mentioned some rituals that could increase the chances of getting a good item. After reading this, the protagonist became furious, as there was no way he could perform them, since he was just an ordinary flower. And he would not be able to take a bath, light incense, or change his clothes. In addition, the realization that he had just eaten a dung beetle added to his anger. He decided to ignore it, however, as he was now just a flower with a big mouth that had grown out of alpaca dung. After calming down a bit, he told the system to let her open the chest. After the chest opened, it shone with a bright golden light. The system's spirit Ruhua appeared out of nowhere and told the protagonist that this time he was rewarded with 20,000 evolution points. The protagonist, still reeling from having eaten a dung beetle, asked the spirit in an irritated voice why he needed to evolve at all if he was already garbage. To which the spirit replied that it was a plant system in which the weirder the food he ate, the higher the chance that he would get a good item from the chest. After listening to Ruhua's words, Wu Sun couldn't find anything to reply, and he had no desire to argue with the system's spirit right now. After a while, the grass that was growing near Wu Sun rustled, and the next moment, the culprit who broke the silence appeared. It was the same yellow gecko that we had seen before, but this time it looked very frightened and as if it was running away from someone. Not paying attention to the frightened look of the lizard, the protagonist with his toothy smile on his face asked him how he dared to come back here after taking away his prey. After which, with the words that the latter would pay for the wrongs he had done, Wu Sun lunged towards the gecko with his tentacle, using his trademark lightning strike. However, suddenly, something very similar to a tongue appeared behind the gecko fleeing in panic, which was also approaching it at a tremendous speed. Despite being caught between two crossfires, both the protagonist's whip and the unknown creature that was supposed to be the tongue's owner, the gecko miraculously managed to dodge. However, the lizard was no longer important to Wu Sun, as he was now more concerned with the creature that the gecko was fleeing from in panic, and the one who was the owner of the tongue. With his eyes wide open, the protagonist watched as the creature retracted its long tongue back. After that, a head covered in spikes appeared. As it turned out, in front of him was a huge frog whose skin was covered with spikes, while its eyes glowed threateningly with a red light. The frog pushed off the ground and jumped into the air, heading straight for our protagonist, who was frozen in place, unable to move. Having recovered from the shock, he desperately wondered why he was attacked by such a big frog. He had no time to despair, however, as his life hung in the balance. In addition, he was also caught up in the fact that the frog had abandoned its pursuit of the gecko and turned its attention to him, thinking that he was easy prey. The next moment he was out of his daze, and he swung his tentacle with all his might at the huge frog, shouting furiously for it to get out of here. It flipped in the air and fell to the ground with a thud, but the next moment it was standing on the ground. But in the next moment, it was already standing on its feet, staring at Wu Sun angrily with its red eyes that clearly showed its rage. Deciding not to wait for the frog to fully recover and attack him, the protagonist decided to attack first, swinging at it with his tentacle, which would act as a whip in this attack. As planned, the whip attack hit the target. However, it did not do the expected damage. After receiving the blow, the frog only squinted its eyes. In the next moment, the toad fiercely grabbed the tentacle of Wu Sun, who did not anticipate this outcome and did not have time to return it to him. The protagonist, meanwhile, was trying with all his might not to be dragged away by the frog, which had already begun to forcefully pull on his tentacle, and was pondering how the frog was able to repel his attack so easily. To his senses, it felt like he had hit a rock. But he had no more time to ponder, as the next moment, the frog stuck out its huge tongue and wrapped it around his stem. This action from the frog left Wu Sun confused as he didn't quite understand what it was going to do now. But in the next moment, everything became very clear. After all, the frog grabbed the stem of the main character and began to tear it out of the ground along with the roots. Realizing that now his beautiful new life could end, Wu Sun panicked and started to scream loudly and try to resist. After the frog had firmly grasped his stem with his tongue, he began to pull with force and our flower began to slowly separate from the ground, and when his stubs began to break off he cried out, "It hurts." It hurt so much that he felt like his body was about to be torn apart. He now had a pressing question: do plants feel pain like animals? He continued to cling to the ground with his roots with tears in his eyes. Now he understood how all those poor plants, flowers and grass felt, on which he had taken out all his anger in his past life. Now it seemed to him that the pain he was feeling was God's punishment for the pain he had once inflicted on the plants. The frog was inexorably pulling him harder and harder, ripping him out along with a piece of earth. Wu Sun realized that it seemed like it was all over for him now, as he would most likely die if he was uprooted from the ground. He could already see the cold breath of death at the back of his head. He didn't think he would feel it again so soon. But when there was no more hope he noticed something, or rather someone, and he was surprised and frightened. A yellow gecko, already familiar to us, appeared on the branch above the frog. He did not understand what the little lizard was going to do, whether he wanted to avenge his lost tail or to help him with the frog. The gecko, in order not to lose his advantage of surprise and not to alert the frog with his finger, showed our flower to be silent and not to draw attention to him. Wu Sun was very surprised at this turn of events. How did the gecko know such gestures, and why did he look so smart? What kind of world had he gotten into that all the beasts here were so smart and cunning? This could be a problem for him in the future if he lived to see it. The gecko didn't wait long and jumped at the frog from the branch. He landed right on its head between its ugly yellow eyes. And before the frog woke up from the surprise and had time to throw him off, he aimed his toothy mouth right at its eye. After his bite, dark blood gushed from the frog's eye. The frog would have howled from the pain if it could, but as it only made an incomprehensible sound and jumped up on the spot, it was forced to retract its tongue back, letting go of our toothy flower. The frog fell on its back, going to crush the pesky gecko, but it failed as it jumped off in time. But as long as the frog left the flower alone, this was his chance. Wu Sun sighed from fatigue and realizing how close he was to death, but he didn't have much time. Therefore, he immediately began to prepare for the attack and raised his battle whip. He wrapped it around the wounded frog and bound it tightly before it could even quack. Then he was going to throw it away with force and plow the ground in the clearing with it. Which he eventually did. After that he began to spin the frog, throwing it against the ground and then spinning it again. This made it dizzy and its tongue fell out. But the frog had another trick up her sleeve that she was saving especially for situations like this. She let some slippery and smelly liquid out of her skin. And when it hit the whip, the frog just slipped off it and flopped to the ground. Our flower did not have time to react in time from such a surprise and was a little confused. He thought that the frog is already in his hands and it cannot escape. However, thanks to its trick, it has already successfully jumped away from this unfortunate flower, which brought it so much pain and trouble instead of a light snack. Our flower still tried to reach her with his whip, but it was already too late and the frog was running away from him in the distance. This situation made him very angry with our toothy flower, who was very close to dealing with the frog once and for all, but her tricks and ability to run fast saved her pimply skin. But nothing, now at least she wouldn't dare to come near him next time. Then he remembered how much it hurt him when the frog tried to pull him out of the ground and realized how vulnerable he was as a plant. He was dependent on soil, moisture, sun, he couldn't escape, he was very fragile and always in danger, even a regular frog almost killed him. He sadly asked himself, would he ever be able to become human again? However, there was a silver lining. After his battle with the frog he had a new friend, a small yellow gecko. He didn't speak, but waved at him with the rest of his tail. Flower didn't like this very much and tensed him up, so he asked what he was doing. Was he trying to ask forgiveness for bringing that nasty frog here? Without saying anything in reply, the gecko began to pick up clods of earth with his paws. Then he took the clump of earth and covered the bare roots with it under the surprised look of the flower. Wu Sun even started to shout at him that he was a little rascal who first brings trouble on his tail and then tries to make amends. But when he felt relief from the moisture and shade on his roots, he was a little more sympathetic to him, and even said with a toothy grin that since he had helped him with the frog and the soil, he would not be angry with him. Gekon seemed very glad that he wasn't being chased away. The gecko continued to rake the soil around the roots of the flower. And our hero was quite surprised that the gecko seemed to understand his words. He wondered if it was normal for the gecko to understand his words, if he knew how to use the environment to fight his enemies, if he knew how to use the soil to fertilize the plants. If that was the case, then the other question was, what language was he speaking now? Was it a human language or the language of flowers or maybe animals? When the gecko finished fertilizing the flower he turned around and was about to go about his business, but our hero decided to see if he understood him. So, he shouted to him that since he was leaving, at least let him say goodbye properly. But it seemed that the gecko did not pay attention to his words and continued his movement. And he sighed disappointedly, and he thought he had really found a friend to talk to. As it turned out, the gecko didn't go far and stopped at the edge of their clearing of grass and paused for a moment. Then noticing movement in the grass, he caught a bug with his long and sticky tongue. And then with a satisfied smile like a dog who carries a ball to his master, he started to return to the flower. Gekon ran up to the flower and poked him in the cheek with his tongue, who did not understand what was happening and why he was poking him with his nasty tongue. He started to tell him that it is disgusting when someone pokes you with his slobbery tongue, but then the gecko showed him a bug on his tongue, which he apparently wanted to give him. He was making incomprehensible noises and pointing his finger at the bug as if offering to take it. Our flower was hungry enough, and realizing what the gecko was offering him, he opened his mouth pointing at it. But what was wrong in their pantomime, and they did not fully understand each other, because the gecko did not give him the bug, so the flower asked, "What does he want?" Was he afraid he would eat the bug along with its tongue? And it seemed to be true, because the gecko nodded happily in response. He thought that such a smart lizard could not be fooled, even if he wanted to. But, he knew how to solve their situation, so he suggested that the gecko put the bug on the ground in front of him, and then he would deal with it since he didn't trust him. However, the gecko understood everything in his own way and seemed to have decided that the flower could be trusted after all, and now he came closer with the bug on his tongue. Our flower didn't know how to react to all this. But his second confusion was not long, because he knew well the saying, "When they give you take, if they hit you run," so he grabbed the bug with his whip and threw it into his toothy mouth. He hoped it would help him to evolve. Surprisingly it did. Right after he swallowed the bug, the spirit of Ruhwa and information windows appeared in front of him, congratulating him on getting the next random treasure chest thanks to eating a live bug. He again needed to accumulate 10,000 evolution points to open the chest. Also, after a certain number of open crates, he would be able to get an additional reward. There was also a funny note that warned that before opening a treasure chest it was worth taking a bath, changing clothes, lighting incense and praying to all known gods. This was supposed to increase the probability of rare items falling out. But it's not certain. Also, after all the notifications, the system would ask him if he wanted to open the chest since he had enough points. Ruhwa looked at the yellow gecko with interest. Our hero, upon seeing his gaze, explained that it was his new friend whom he met during the battle with the uninvited guest. Then Wu Sun turned to his new friend and asked if he wanted to help him open the treasure chest as a reward for his help. Gecko simply stared at him questioningly in response. This behavior did not please Ruhwa, who was sitting on the chest with a frown. Our flower realized that he was wrong again and overestimated the level of intelligence of the gecko, and decided to simplify everything for him as much as possible and choose one of the two phrases, "open the chest" and "do not open the chest." And who would have thought, the joyful gecko made a sound similar to "open." Our hero was pleased with the progress in their communication, and turning to his system spirit Ruhwa, told him to open the chest since that's what even the lizard said. An information box appeared, congratulating him on obtaining a B-level vine gene that could be integrated into the stem, and asking if he wanted to use it now. Also, under the illustration of the vine, its properties and benefits to the plant were explained. But since he already had one vine integrated, the system offered him two options for gene fusion. The first option was to upgrade and strengthen the existing vine. The second was to add another additional vine. And further, the skill was offered to choose one of the options for its development. Our hero was very happy about the opportunity to develop and was not shy to tell everyone around him about it. He stroked his already tame gecko and praised it, because thanks to it he got a good level item. But now he was faced with a difficult choice, which way to go to strengthen his vine or to get an additional one. As he pondered, he recalled the details of his fight with the frog and realized that he had almost been uprooted because he didn't have enough vines. That was why he had chosen the second option. Hearing his answer, Ruhwa pulled out his magic fairy wand and announced that there would now be a fusion of his stem with the new gene. Our hero was engulfed in streams of green energy, and the next system window appeared, where our flower was congratulated on the integration of another gene that allowed him to turn his stems into whips to fight his enemies. It could also now officially refer to itself as a tentacle monster. True, with only 2 tentacles, but that didn't matter. Wu Sun was expecting something more, and he began to resent the thin and short whip he had been given. Wasn't there something bigger and prettier? Rouvoir replied that not everything is so fast and there are no shortcuts. He has already accumulated a lot of evolution points and he is sure that our flower will become longer and thicker in the near future, just like everyone dreamed.